Welcome to Global Horizons Virtual and the second of a 5-part webcast series leading up to the 36th Annual Global Horizons Conference in London, 2021. Both result from a unique partnership between Oxford Analytica, the pioneer of geopolitical analysis, and the Conference Board, the leading business think tank providing insights for what's ahead. Today, we examine a critical issue confronting business, government, and society: the COVID-19 pandemic, the disruption it has created for business, and the need for companies to adapt in the face of advancing automation. Please engage in this important conversation by asking questions, downloading the presentation, and sharing this program with colleagues. If you are requesting credits, click the 3 pop-up boxes throughout the program. Now,
hello everyone, and welcome to the Global Horizons virtual panel on the COVID-19 crisis and the future of work. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Mark Elsner, and I'm Director of Advisory at Oxford Analytica. For 35 years, Oxford Analytica has held the Global Horizons Conference on geopolitics, the economy, and business issues in person in Oxford. This year, for the first time, Global Horizons is a collaboration between Oxford Analytica and the Conference Board. It now consists of a series of webcasts which started this month and will continue up until our in-person event in London on March the 23rd and 24th, 2021. All being well, we really hope you can join us for that. At this point, let me say a special thank you to the sponsors of Global Horizons, EY. And now let's turn to today's panel. So you're very welcome to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen below the videos. And you may also wish to apply for credits. Please see the instructions on the screen for those. Now, to introduce our panelists and the topic, I'm delighted to turn to my co-moderator, Executive Vice President for Human Capital at the Conference Board, Dr. Rebecca Ray. Rebecca, over to you.
Mark, it's a real pleasure. It's exciting to be part of this series, but it's especially exciting to be here with you today with some outstanding folks who are going to help us think through some of the questions around the impact of COVID-19 and the future of work. It's an absolute delight to welcome these distinguished panelists. In no particular order, as they each bring tremendous insights and experience to the table. But we have with us Dr. Carl Benedict Frey. He is affiliated with Oxford University and is a leading thinker in the future of work. Does a great deal of work in this field, and particularly as it relates to automation and the impact it will have. So, Carl, thank you so much for joining us today. Perfect. And we also have Peter Fasolo, and Dr. Fasolo is the Executive Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer at Johnson & Johnson. And I've had the pleasure to learn from Peter and his team over the years. And I thought, what a great opportunity to hear from an outstanding company in the healthcare industry who's been at the forefront not only of this particular pandemic, but also thoughtful about the impact that it will have in the workplace. So, Peter, thank you for joining us.
Rebecca and Mark, thank you for having me.
Of course. Joe Whittinghill is responsible for talent and learning and insights at Microsoft, as you can see. And I think, given the conversation we're about to have, who better than someone who's driving that kind of development at one of the world's most leading-edge tech companies to think about what are the implications for talent, for learning, for culture, and for analytics in the workplace. And I'm really thrilled to have you with us today, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. And rounding out our panel of experts is Sylvia Hernandez, and you can see that she's a partner in the People Advisory Services at EY. Sylvia and I have worked together in the past. I've learned a great deal, particularly as she shared the insights that comes from the collective work that she and her colleagues do at EY. And I'm thrilled to have you with us because I'm hopeful you'll bring that broad view of what's going on with so many of your clients right now. So, Sylvia, thank you for joining.
Glad to be here.
So one of the things that I'd like to suggest we step back for just a moment is to talk a little bit about COVID-19. And for many parts of the world, this has been experienced differently, and there are levels of impact around the world, but certainly all of us have been touched by it. And compounding this is the knock-on effects of an economic challenge, as well as civil unrest and a variety of other issues. But at the core of it is a pandemic that I believe will fundamentally change the way we work, the way we think about work, the worker and corporation or organization contract. And so we'd like to talk a little bit today about how the world of work will be changed by this pandemic. You know, we're also going to try to touch on how workers can survive the immediate impacts and then thrive, and what might that be. Corporate responses to not only the worker and the worker experience, but also the support for the physical and mental well-being of employees. This is not the first crisis that many people have experienced, and yet there seems to be a great deal of focus on mental health and well-being in a way that I haven't seen in the past, which I think is a wonderful thing. And then let's also think too about, you know, what happens to the purpose, the mission of an organization, the workers who are expected to continue to play out their responsibilities in a way that builds that mission, and what happens to culture. So those are the kinds of things we're going to touch on today, and I'm going to ask our distinguished panelists to weigh in and share their thoughts as we go along. I'm also hopeful that this will be interactive for you as well. We've got some poll questions coming along, and as Mark mentioned, there's opportunities for you to ask questions if you use the chat box. So why don't we go to our very first poll question, and it'll be up on the screen in a moment. We'll give you just about a minute to respond. Please select the areas where you think there's going to be a tremendous impact long-term from the COVID-19. And then I will ask the panelists to just give a very quick response to what our attendees today are telling us. So take just a moment, and then we'll take a look at how we seem to feel about things. About 20 seconds, and we'll see where we are. Okay, great. If I could ask the terrific people in the control room to show the results. Well, clearly, greater reliance on remote work and kind of a tie for more automation, a decline in urban settings, a greater emphasis on mental health and well-being, and a need for a new leadership style. So let me switch back to our slides, and let me ask our esteemed panelists to do a very quick reaction to what our attendees today told us. What do you think? Could we start with Carl?
Well, clearly hardly anybody thinks that this is not the time of tremendous change, and we're all sitting here working from home, so the fact that there will be more remote work seems like an obvious one. What stands out to me is that very few people think that we will see an increase in gig work, and I also think that that's broadly right. I think that what we're going to see after this is a new social contract being drawn up, in which more lasting employer-employee relationships will be the norm.
Thanks, Carl. Peter, your very quick reaction.
I think the psychology of the workforce coming back will be unprecedented in terms of piercing to the other side, and I think the responsibility of corporations is to absorb that and ensure that they're doing everything they can to ensure that they have a committed and engaged workforce with respect to the workforce's anxieties, their stressors, as well as the balances that they have to make sure that they keep together. And I'm sure we'll get into that conversation, Rebecca, a bit later in the webinar.
Very good. Thank you so much, Joe. Your thoughts?
We would agree with the prioritization that the poll showed, and then what my other colleagues on the panel have just stated. And we're exploring what this will mean to the role of managers. Our belief is how we manage and what our managers are going to need to do to effectively manage in these new times is going to be a critical lever for success leading into the future.
Thanks, Joe. And Sylvia, your thoughts?
So I would add to that I see connectivity from what has been said. I think the increase in remote work and the emergence of gig workers would probably help us as organizations focus a little bit more on mental health and the well-being of workers, which I hope is going to result in evolved leadership, right? So I think that all of those changes are connected, and they would result hopefully in a more meaningful, fulfilling work and environment for work.
Absolutely. And so thank you for that very quick reaction. So what I'd like to do now is perhaps move into an opportunity for a little bit more of a lengthy response. And Mark, do you want to kick us off here?
Okay, sure. Thanks very much, Rebecca. So we'd like to go into this question in a little bit more depth now with each of our panelists. Question being, what are the lasting impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic that will fundamentally change the world of work as we know it? And starting with you, Peter, perhaps you could tell us your thoughts on this answer with particular emphasis on the impact on essential workers, customer care, the rethinking of the role of HR, and whatever else comes to your mind and topic.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for the question. I think large global companies now are responding in a variety of different phases that are continuing. When the pandemic hit, most companies for the first 12 to 14 weeks of the pandemic were resolved in ensuring employee safety. At Johnson & Johnson, we have about a third of our workforce who are considered essential coming into work every day, mostly in supply chain and clinical labs. We have these superheroes at work that are driving towards the identification of a vaccine candidate. These are true superheroes on the world stage, and we had to ensure their safety, their well-being, and I'm very proud of the way Johnson & Johnson has responded, from personal protection to protecting pay to child care backup to volunteerism and the like. We're now in the phase of how does one think about returning to the workplace, and that has a whole different set of elements to it with respect to, again, safety at work, ensuring a certain percentage are coming back, and making sure that the critical capabilities that are so important to Johnson & Johnson are in fact ensuring that we get the job done on the world stage. The more interesting part of your question is where we are going next in reimagining the world of work, piercing through the other side. And the work has to take place now with respect to reimagining how people are coming back to work. To your lightning round question, what is the future selling models? How do you accelerate technology and digital? What's the strategy on your global footprint? What do you need? And what really is the nature of collaboration? I think what the last 14 weeks have taught us is less about remote work or not remote work. I think the more interesting question is, what have we learned about collaboration, social connection, and the desire for people to be together to drive innovation? To me, that is the real reimagining of companies, and it's shattered our assumption that we had just 14 weeks ago of how and when people connect together.
Peter, I love the thought about reimagining, because the question should be not how do we go back to the way it was, but rather what are we going to move toward, right? And for so many, depending on which industry, which geographic area, what the underlying conditions were in a particular organization, that could look very, very different now. So I think you're spot on. The question is what do we want to create? And I think that's the big question. Thanks, Peter. And shall we maybe hear also from you, Joe?
So we think that the workplace is permanently changed, that we will not return to work. We've even started to not use that term because it is going to be different moving forward. And I think that, as Peter said, there has been this conversation that is both a technical one around what are the technologies that companies like ours need to provide much more quickly to the world to allow things like a Johnson & Johnson or healthcare workers or first responders deal with this pandemic in a way that we would not normally have done at speed. And so we have pivoted big parts of our company and where we would have been spending time in other places to getting our collaboration tools to operate at scale that is quite frankly massive. Number two has been looking at what is our responsibility to our customers that may not have been as far along in their digital transformation to get them to a place where they can more quickly move to digital to allow work to continue and to allow collaboration to increase. And then a real representative example, I think we're learning that in education, so K through university, the thought that they could simply go do schooling from home isn't working as well as anyone would like. And that is both a technical but also an adaptive challenge of what are the ways we are going to have to help these school systems operate very, very differently than how they had planned in a way that delivers effective education. So each one of these is both these technical things we're trying to solve, but also then when we'll speak later about the adaptive challenges around then what is our responsibility that maybe wasn't there 14 weeks ago that we need to respond to, and not out of profit motive, but out of purpose motive.
I think there's a real difference if your organization was already predisposed to do remote work and to have workers with a more flexible style. And if there are many companies that I think were caught a little flat-footed here. Sylvia, perhaps you could share a little bit about what you're seeing with your clients, and then I'd love Carl's thoughts on sort of the automation tech end of the spectrum here, your thoughts on how we are changed.
Yeah, so I'll pick up a little bit on what's been said already. So from our perspective, client responses as well as our own response have largely been determined by government responses and, of course, the severity of the pandemic in the locations in which they operate. Responses have been very, very broad, and I would classify them sort of in two stages, if you want. The first stage, was focused very clearly on mitigating risk for employees and customers to enable a trusted transition back to the physical operations, to the physical workplace. The second piece is I think the most interesting one, and I'll touch a little bit on this, is been exploring, how do we use this crisis, if you want, to reimagine work, ultimately, not just transitioning, but transforming the organizations. And I think that this is where we have a very open canvas, right? We've all had to really think about this and just imagine the futures, not just modeling potential or plausibility of the options, but actually to invent and design them, right? And I think a lot of the focus of the organizations that we work with is around synchronizing technology to sort of shape work for the 21st century. The implications of some of these actions are really, really important. I think a lot of pressure or a lot of thinking is being given to how to evolve command and control structures that are very prevalent in some of the automotive industry, for example. How do we think about shifting the focus that we've had, particularly in Germany, where I'm based, in terms of physical presence to, how do we value employees' contribution where we don't see them or where they're not in the office, right? So I think the question is then becoming, how do you contribute to our outcomes? How do you create value as opposed to how many hours are you in the office? I'll just quickly summarize that I think we see actions and strategies emerging in three dimensions. The first one being around health and safety. So a lot of companies are starting to really pivot to thinking about the total well-being of their staff, not just physical and mental, but also financial. There's a tremendous acceleration and pickup of technology around touchless systems and voice-activated controls. And my guess is that, this culture of care is going to inform everything that a company does as it applies the lessons from COVID to a new business cycle that I hope is going to be defined by value as opposed to growth, right, or by value more than growth. The second area is technology, and I know that Carl will be speaking about this in a second, but I think that the key message around this is that the rapid adoption of collaboration tools and remote working technology, while surprisingly has maintained productivity, has kind of issued or raised issues around isolation and employee engagement. And so I think that there's the question of connectivity, but also validating that workforce is on a constant trajectory of training to enable a culture where no one is left behind is become a focus area. And the last area that I'll touch on is kind of the pandemic is put a question on physical space, right? We're all reevaluating our real estate needs, and companies are starting to announce shifts to hybrid workforce models. Some start working permanently from home, whereas others where they do need a physical location are starting to think about it flexibly. And so, I just wrap up by saying that I think organizations will continue to optimize work for efficiency and productivity, but really focus on employee experience. And I think the culture of online work is kind of being rewritten as we speak. We're kind of building it. But I think critical to that would be the culture the organization demonstrates and a collaborative action to define purpose that energizes that.
Thanks, Sylvia. And Carl, we're getting a few questions now around technology and its impact and how lasting, how disruptive, how will it play a role going forward. So I'd love your thoughts.
Well, we're clearly living through this experiment or forced experiment of enormous disruption to the ways we live and work. And what we see is that many of us have shifted into remote work, and whatever business will have to find out over the next couple of weeks, months and years is not just what can be done at home, but what is most productively done at home. With some jobs, it's abundantly clear a lab technician can't work from home. They need specialized equipment. They need to be on site. But there are many jobs and tasks where it is less clear, because what we know from history is that workers in knowledge industries in particular have been very clustered because they've benefited from the proximity to other smart people. That is why work was highly clustered in Renaissance Florence, to Victorian Birmingham in Britain, to Detroit in the 20th century, to Silicon Valley and Seattle today. And I think the way I think about this at least is in terms of looking at the project or the product life cycle. So when I write a paper or when I write a book, I want to talk to people, and many of the best ideas I get are through spontaneous interactions and conferences, because if I could have anticipated an interaction, then I could just have looked it up online. So in the early days when you try to settle on what you want to do and you want to collect ideas, it is important to be close to other people with brilliant ideas, and then you want to be at the office. But at some point you will arrive at a stage where you just want to get the project and get the work done, and you settle on your idea. You know what the project looks like, or you know what your product is going to look like, and then in my case at least, I want to retire in my home and don't be disturbed and finish my article up. And I think what every business needs to do is to look very closely at their workflows, figure out what these project life cycles look like, and try to manage the office space versus remote work in a way that you take maximum advantage of these interactions at the office. So you construct your office space in a way that allows for a lot of these spontaneous interactions. And when people settle on what their projects look like and just want to execute, then they can work remotely. And I think that is the balance that every business faces right now. And to conclude, when something is done remotely, often it can also be done in a different country. And I think for certain jobs that can be done remotely entirely, they can also be offshored to low-cost destinations. And when things can be offshored, they can also often be routinized and automated. And I think that is sort of the final step of this process. So we're now in this big experiment where we're trying to figure out what the workflows should look like. over the long run, I think there's tremendous opportunity for rapid productivity growth as businesses figure out how to structure their office space to become more innovative, how to cut labor costs by moving things offshore, and how to leverage automation technologies to cut costs even further.
Thank you. I take it from here, Rebecca. Thank you very much, Carl. That was a great lead-in, in fact, to our next polling question. So please do participate again. The question this time is about post-COVID-19 and the relationship between workers and organizations. Will that relationship be fundamentally changed? You can choose between significantly different relations in future, somewhat different, no lasting change, or don't know. I think we know where this one's going to go, but it's good to see it heading in that direction. I think we can probably start closing the poll already the next 3 seconds. 2, 1. Thank you very much. So, no doubt it seems the world will be different in terms of the relationship between workers and organizations. You agree with that, Peter?
Absolutely, Mark, and I am not surprised at the predominance of the significantly to somewhat different. I think ultimately, as we'll get into probably further in the discussions, the trust quotient, the relationship between the organization and the employee, although always important, is absolutely paramount in this kind of world. Because as Rebecca just mentioned and the other panelists have alluded to, the trust that happens between an employee and the organization is the fuel that will keep them together. And if you went into this pandemic with a highly engaged, very, very connected workforce, and in a world where more workers are looking to organizations and leaders for direction, then you're coming out of this, or will come out of this, even stronger if you can maintain that. The fundamental issue for corporations is do not lose your workforce, because that is the essence of how you bring innovation in products and services into the marketplace. And it's always been important, but it's critical today.
Peter, just before we move along with other responses, we do have a question. I'd love your thoughts. Asking about the fundamental shifts of the HR function and perhaps the role of the CHRO in particular, and wondering if you share that same perception that indeed it will be different going forward.
There's no question, Rebecca. I think the role of the human resources function and the CHRO it's been put on center stage over the last several months. This is all about people. It's about trust. It's ensuring that the head of HR and the entire HR organization ensures that they are the stewards of the company culture. I think Joe said it extremely well. The role of the manager, which we know has always been critical in organizations, is now mission critical. Because again, companies like Microsoft or Johnson & Johnson or other large companies, they have very progressive policies and approaches, but at the end of the day, they are pulled through at a local level by a manager. And the kind of trust that they create inside their unit. Manager is everything, and the head of HR and the HR function is all about ensuring that they have the trust and the stewardship of the culture over time. Because if that is broken, then it's very, very hard to get back.
Yeah, I mean, the time that you need trust and faith in each other is not the time at a crisis.
Absolutely.
That's got to be built brick by brick, long before that.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, Mark, I just wanted to work that question in. I thought it was so on point for Peter.
Thanks. Well, Sylvia, your initial thoughts on those poll results? I guess no surprises for you either?
So I was a little bit surprised that we're not more on the significant change. I actually think that the pandemic has fundamentally changed social contracts between businesses and their employees. And I think that, Peter was talking about trust. I think that, at a time of crisis, our ability to trust is put to the test. And so I think that, working on rebuilding that is fundamental. And I think that there's going to be, a renewed set of parameters for how we engage as organizations, as employees, as gig workers. So I do see significant changes in that question.
Absolutely. Joe, how about your reaction to that poll result?
So I agree with Sylvia and Peter very strongly, and would add that we believe employees are looking to the corporation now to have a different relationship with them. And we'll speak a bit about mental health here, but what employees are expecting the organization, at least ours, to do is to provide more to them in ways, though, that is very individually crafted for them, so that they have the ability to create the working relationship with the organization in a way that allows them to be successful. And I think the other point that we're seeing is organizations, especially for-profit organizations, are being asked to take stands on issues that we normally wouldn't have in the past. And this is being fueled through the pandemic, but through lots of other geopolitical issues that are going on in the world today. But the change, and maybe it was with Sylvia, I thought people might say it strongly versus, somewhat, because I think this is going to be a significant change in how we engage in that social as well as business contract, not only with our employees, but with our vendors, our contractors, our interns. It is going to be, a new world of work that we've all been talking about. It's here.
Thank you. Carl, anything from your side in terms of those poll results?
Yeah, I agree with what has been said, and just to add to that, so I think it is important to remember, if we look back in time to the 1920s, where a lot of businesses instituted pensions, welfare schemes, began looking after their workers in a more comprehensive way. A decade later, the Depression hit, and those schemes were rolled back very quickly, and government stepped in on unprecedented scale with the National Recovery Act to fill that gap. And I think governments today will be looking very closely at how businesses manage these crises. And I think it is important for every business that can afford it, it should be said, because there are a lot of businesses that are hurting throughout this crisis as well and are in desperate need to cut costs. But I think for the businesses that can afford it, they will be in a much better shape if they strengthen ties with their employees during this period of time. And I think governments will be looking very closely at how that process is managed.
Thank you, Carl. So turning back to you initially, Sylvia, and picking up on the point that Carl just mentioned, with your experience working with EY, with companies in many different sectors, I know you work a lot with automotive companies there in Germany. How do you see companies changing or creating new environments in which their workers can thrive and can be increasingly productive? And going back to that final point Carl made, what are the risks of failing to create such environments?
Right. So, let me start by talking about I think the opportunities that are connected with doing so, right? Because I think the risk of failing to create those environments might sort of go in the way of extinction, right? Which is not a positive scenario. So if I think about this positively, I think, just to frame the question, for the first time in history, the human population has been united around the world around this pandemic. And I think with this level of uncertainty, right, which has been, I think, unprecedented, our human ability to trust is really put to the test. So I think that in order for, and we've talked about this, just as we were discussing the poll results, I think more than ever organizations and their leaders need to think or need to make their decisions by putting, their people at the heart of the organization and the decisions that they make. If they are going to be rebuilding trust or building trust, that is now necessary to build enterprise resilience. And so, I think that in a first instance, organizations are going to be adapting operations, right? And in doing so, they're combining actionable plans with a longer-term transformation ideas or features that we have discussed. And in doing so, I think communication is vital, not just to communication to the employees, but also to the customers and to the communities in which they operate, right? So I think is that communication from the organization needs to be focused on the broader stakeholder community. As we navigate through the crisis, I think organizations need to focus on protecting, enabling, and supporting their teams, right? So enabling resources for safety and crisis management and keeping that dialogue very active. I think that the transition to remote working, we've talked about it briefly earlier, have shown some feeling of disconnect and isolation has been reported commonly, and I think we need to keep coming out with that communication even when we don't have all the answers, right? And I think particularly in the part of the world that I'm at, that is a real challenge, right? Communicating when we don't have a real plan or a safe plan is been something that we've been faced with for the first time. I think from an HR perspective, I can speak about the HR function, and Peter was talking about this earlier. I think it requires that HR is integrated with the rest of the enterprise just to build a complete picture of the systems that need to be created to best serve that workforce. And I think Joe was talking about the expectations that Microsoft employees have. I would say that resonates with what we hear from our clients, but also from our own employees. And I think that when we talk about focusing on the workforce, I think we should be thinking about the workforce ecosystem, right? So just not employees or gig workers, suppliers, but just the entire community of people that we work with a focus on the needs to upskill and reskill employees to support those operational changes, right? So there's kind of greater accountability perspective from the organization. And so I think, in summary, I would just say that we are navigating uncharted waters, we all know, and I think that the key to navigating some of this is putting employees and that ecosystem at the center of how we make decisions, which will, in my view, cultivate trust with the workforce, but also with the broader community. And so I think that organizations that succeed at doing so will emerge transformed from this pandemic.
Yeah, Sylvia, I believe that's true. I believe it is fundamentally changed. I mean, we are asking people to be productive against the backdrop of a pandemic where, we're all sort of at Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the bottom. Can I trust the food supply? How do I fix my children? Do I have enough, infrastructure capability to be able to connect to the internet? Can I keep my job? Which, for a lot of people, they're thinking hours would be cut, bonuses would be cut. They may or may not have a job, or they're fearful of it. How do you balance all of that and your obligations as an adult? And against that backdrop, we've watched employees, for the most part, be as productive, and in some cases, if not more so. I've spoken with several CHROs who will cite the call center statistics before and after folks flipped the switch and went remote, even in such highly regulated industries as financial services, and they are, surprised isn't the right word, but I guess it's reaffirmed for them that people can be productive, which we knew, from earlier days, but against this backdrop, they're still productive. So I think that's a testament to the human psyche. Yeah. It's not sustainable long term. I mean, there's a lot of people, especially, Peter talked about trust. If you can connect people to the mission and they trust their leaders, and that's terrific. But I think it's not sustainable long term. So the question is, how do you then re-engage folks who are probably needing to recover themselves, if you will? Right. Well, thank you.
And just
no, please.
I just wanted to add a thought to that, if I may. I think that we're going to talk about purpose, or purpose has come up in different parts of this conversation, and I think that a lot of the things that we explore and like to talk about is that companies that are able to articulate that purpose and kind of communicate it through, tend to activate that kind of response in employees, even in those circumstances. And so I think that that's probably going to be focus of the conversations going forward.
No question in my mind. I think you're exactly right. Which brings us to the reliance on automation and technology. Ginni Rometty, the outgoing CEO of IBM, said, wherever you were on your digital transformation, it's been accelerated. And, So it's a little bit like the future. It arrives at different times and in different ways for different folks, but we're all on that path now. And so, Carl, who better than you then to talk a little bit about whether or not this heavier reliance on technology will then require us not only to have a new kind of manager or different leadership skills that Joe alluded to, but maybe this sort of tech-savvy underlying core competency of senior leaders. Could you speak to that?
Sure. So, yeah, I think it's first of all important to note that automation has been going on for 200 years, so that part is not new. But it has been happening in spurts, and it's often been happening during, in particular, economic downturns. So what we saw during the Great Recession, for example, is that routine rule-based activities, so easy to automate, essentially disappeared as businesses cut costs. What we also saw is that consumers during these periods of time tend to opt for cheaper goods and services. And when people go to McDonald's rather than the average restaurant, they increase the level of automation in the economy. So we're seeing important shifts towards more automation during times of crisis, and I think we are seeing this time again. I think two additional things are different this time around. One is that robots help us to achieve social distance, which will be desirable objectives at least until we have a vaccine, and we don't know when that will happen. But we're already seeing hospitals increasingly using robots to deliver food and medicine. We're seeing FedEx experimenting with delivery robots that can climb stairs. We're seeing warehouse automation accelerating because that has proven to be one of the key bottlenecks during this crisis. So it's absolutely clear to me that we're going to see more automation as a result of this pandemic. Now, does that mean that we will have to have more tech-trained CEOs or senior leaders? Well, during the 1920s, when electrical engineers began to experiment with machinery on the factory floors, that required managers to have an understanding of how the technology was used, but not necessarily of how the technology exactly worked. I think that the same is true in a sense this time around. We don't need managers to be full-fledged information engineers, but we need them to know how the technology works, what its limits are, what can be effectively automated, what cannot, and that requires good collaboration between information engineers, people that build these technologies for a living, and senior managers who obviously need to understand the business that they are in. And I think when looking to the skills that will be required from leaders this time around, actually have to do more with change management. Because what we see is that during times of rapid change, and particularly during economic downturns, people are concerned about their jobs. They don't have a lot of outside options if their company go down and if the job is automated away. And I think one key task of managers during such turbulent periods of time is to provide guidance, to manage expectations, to say we're going to introduce this measure and this is what the workplace will look at by the end of it. And what you see during previous times of rapid automation is that people are very concerned about the introduction of the technology, but they are actually very content with it when it's been introduced. So it's often the unanticipated, the uncertainty surrounding how things will turn out that is the source of anxiety, not the technology itself. And I think that is important to keep in mind.
Well, it's true that the rapid adoption of, let's say, Microsoft Teams or Zoom or other collaboration platforms, it has really changed. And if you weren't comfortable with that before, you certainly need to have mastered it now. With Slack or pick a variety of things. And I think that's a fundamental shift. I think also the Friday afternoon happy hour is going to be a mainstay of most workplaces going forward. I just think that seems to be a sticky thing. So, Peter, when you think about the workplace, and I don't mean to be flippant about the Friday afternoon happy hours, but it was one way in which many leaders tried to sort of keep their teams together, show that there's another side other than 13 hours a day glued to a screen watching video calls. I wondered if you might speak a little bit to, how workers are how are workers dealing with this, and what's the obligation of a corporation to sort of be attentive to or to put things in place? And I know I'm speaking to a leader in one of the finest healthcare companies in the world, and so you're predisposed, I think, to think about the whole person. But I wonder what your thoughts are, especially you have so many folks who are on the front lines of this pandemic.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. And I do think this is one of the most profound questions that we have to navigate our way through during, and most importantly, after this pandemic. You're right. I'm incredibly proud of our 140,000 employees around the globe that are coming into work or working from home every day because they want to make a difference in patients and customers and consumers' lives. That being said, we also know that the psychology of the worker in general has shifted in profound ways and dramatically. A lot of this comes down to what Carl and Joe and Sylvia were saying about the psychology of the worker and quite frankly, leadership. In order for one to manage and lead others, you first have to ensure that your own energy is in the right place before you can give the energy to others. So what we try to reinforce constantly in our company, that you have to ensure that you are managing your energy nutritionally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, so that you can ensure that you can give that energy to others. We know right now, because we pulse our employees, first it was weekly, now it's every other week, about their sentiment and constantly trying to course correct how we're getting things right or where we have to shift. I'm incredibly proud that our engagement and our employee sentiment stays very, very high, but at the same time, I also know that 50% of our employees are dealing with homeschooling. I know that close to 35% of our employees are dealing with elder care. There's more loneliness and isolation going on within our workforce. So what is our responsibility as an organization? It's to go right into that and to ensure that we're investing in resiliency, mental health support, employee assistance programs, and we're ensuring that we're doubling, tripling down on those kinds of investments. We're doing creative things to make sure that people can have fun step and physical activities remotely to keep people collaboratively together in a remote world. These are not nice to do. These are absolutely required to do to ensure that the mental health and the well-being of your workforce stays critically at the forefront of what we're trying to do with our workforce. And you mentioned before, what's the role of the human resources function? It's to ensure that the investment model of employees stays front and center.
Thank you, Peter.
So critically important.
Yeah. So I saw Joe nodding quite a lot during that contribution there from Peter. So Joe, and sounds like you agree, and could you perhaps also comment on that and link it to the wider question of corporate purpose and whether or not, or rather perhaps the extent to which this is going to be increased as an area of importance for companies?
Yeah. What Peter said we would agree 100% with, and it is not an easy task. And I think that, just briefly, 2 points is we also are aware, and I'm sure Johnson & Johnson and Peter's executive leadership team is, large corporates have an advantage of being able to provide many resources to employees that others are not able to. And some of those are financial resources, but more importantly, sometimes when we get into these conversations, we forget about how limited bandwidth is when you are not near an urban area. And so there are companies that are struggling and organizations struggling with just how do you enable remote work when the DSL line is very low bandwidth. So there is a lot to solve here globally that is, some of it is just practical physics versus even the behavioral and emotional sides that we're all trying to figure out, which leads right into this point about purpose. And I think, briefly, most of you know we've been on a culture journey with Satya as our new CEO for the last 5 years. And he was the one that said very plainly in his first speech to our investors that it isn't our technical strategy that needs to change. What has to change for Microsoft to be successful is our culture. And we then predicated that culture change on the concept of growth mindset, which I think most of you have heard. But what underpins all of that is our steadfast belief in purpose, and that we change the direction of the company, the mission of the company, to be one that is purpose-driven, and then asked all of our employees about words, you could refer to it as either passion, or what we say is, how do you align your purpose with the company's purpose so you can both achieve what you are looking to in your world of work, along with helping the company be successful. And that has turned us in a very good direction around being purposeful on helping our customers and individuals and students be successful, and also then having our employees feel like they are getting what we would say a double hit or a twofer. They feel successful and purpose-driven, helping the company achieve its mission or its purpose. And we've done that just really quickly with some techniques that people on this call will appreciate, which is we've doubled down on the neuroscience of leadership. And what we've relied on a lot during this crisis are our leadership, our new leadership principles. We ask leaders who is everyone in the company. Not everyone is a manager, but everyone can be a leader. And that is to create clarity, to generate energy, and deliver success. We've also then doubled down on our managers and asking them to drive what we've been talking about on this call, the very important connection with individual team members. So again, a practical direction we gave to our global, we have 19,000 managers spread across 190 countries. And we've asked all of them to check in individually with their teams, because we don't view it as 140,000 employees, as we have 19,000 teams operating, and each one of those teams has a team leader or a manager. And we said to those managers, individually increase the number of check-ins with those individual employees greatly. Make sure they're okay, make sure they're healthy, both physically and emotionally through the mental health, and make sure that they feel that they can achieve their work outcomes, given, there's a lot of challenges at home for people who live in small apartments and have children who are trying to homeschool, do their job, and both the spouses work. Or our millennial population, where 3 of them are living in a very small place and they work for 3 companies, and some of those companies may be competitors. We have a lot of, where we are here, Amazon and Microsoft employees living in the same area or in the same unit. And so it gets into some very interesting confidentiality and PII issues. But with these managers, we also rolled out, fortunately for us, just recently, a new manager model that we worked on for a few years, and we asked managers just to do 3 things. We asked them to model the values we want, the culture we want. We want them to coach their employees to be successful. And then, ironically, we hit on a word called care. We said we need our managers to care. So model, coach, and care about their employees in ways that they've never done before. So just for the practitioners, on this call, I think that it is solving for the whole employee. It's also solving for the corporate strategy as well as the employee engagement strategy. And then, I look at people like Peter's role. I mean, it is the golden age of HR right now, and CHROs are being asked to do more than ever before, and they're having to step up in amazing ways. And I know Kathleen Hogan, our CHRO, I say to her often, it's amazing what HR is having to do today to help us get through COVID-19.
I think that's right on. I think that those of us who have, and I say this as a former chief talent officer, but for those of us who've been in this space for a long time, I'm not sure we've ever been quite as relevant or quite as critical to the success of corporations. And I think, I'm conscious that I have great companies represented on this panel, and those don't happen by accident. So that means that folks who have been in the human capital space have been laboring for a long time to make those great companies. But collectively, I think our profession has really shown what it can do. I'm amazed. You see people who are interested in having business-to-business conversations around taking large swaths of people who are about to be furloughed or laid off and putting them to work, and assuming that they've been adequately trained and the due diligence is there, and they're just trying to put people to work. It's just amazing the acts of caring that we have collectively seen. So thank you all for that. We're going to shift gears in these last moments. And in fact, what I may do is I'm going to turn right to our really next poll. And so for those of you who are with us on this call, this is a really quick one. How optimistic are you that your own organization can successfully make the transition to this future world of work? So we'll give you just about 30 seconds. And then when we're done, Mark and I would love to hear from each panelist. Tell us how optimistic you are. And then also if you have any words of advice or lessons learned or final thoughts for those people who are with us today and how they can lead their own organizations through this transition. So tell us of your optimism and then a word of wisdom. Okay, so I think we can see now, if we can just show the results real quick. Most folks, 58%, are highly optimistic. Others are somewhat optimistic, about a third of folks, and then others are perhaps not as optimistic at all. So let's remove this, and we'll go back to the slides. Terrific. And just your final thoughts on what kinds of optimism levels you have, and then what advice would you have? Maybe start with you, Joe.
So we remain very optimistic at Microsoft around the human's ability to respond to crisis. And there is nothing like the need for great leadership and tested leadership during a crisis. So we would agree with the people who are optimistic that we will find ways through this. And we're also finding that humans are very resilient. And when given clear guidance about what's working, what's not working, and what we should do, they will rise to the occasion to figure things out. And so we believe that it isn't just using technology to solve this, it's also the humans banding together, and virtual happy hours are probably a permanent part of our lives from now on, we would agree. But underneath there, it's the psychology of connectedness and relatedness. And so we're pretty excited about where things are going, even though we are in the middle of this pandemic.
Thanks, Joe. And could we hear from you, Sylvia?
I've got to agree with Joe, and I've got to say I'm a relentless optimist personally, so that kind of taints a little bit my ability to see through some of these questions. But I do think that, you know, we have an opportunity collectively to think through some of the things that we've done great in the past, and I think technology is providing a wonderful opportunity to accelerate, you know, this shift from, you know, our growth, you know, looking for growth as opposed to creating value. And so I think that, you know, from my perspective, if we put people at the center of how we make decisions, we will be able to shift to that value creation and actually end up better than we were just before some of this started. So I'm positive about this.
Very good. Carl and then Peter.
Well, I work for an organization that was barely changed in 800 years, and we probably changed more in the 800 hours than the 800 years before. And I think we've done it with such ease, and we get great student evaluations. So if you are not optimistic, I don't know what you're doing.
All right, then. I'll take it at that face value, that it's a great analogy. And Peter?
I share my panelists' optimism. Obviously, your optimism and the arc by which you go through that depends on the industry that you're in and what part of the globe you are, because obviously every industry and every part of the world is dealing with these things at a different pace. But in the main, what we're seeing right now is unbelievable adaptation, real-time learning, leaders and organizations who are stepping up, boundaries dropping, natural decision makers coming together, and walls and organizations coming down because time is collapsing our approach to make decisions. And to me, that's a really good thing. So you have to make sure you capture that and make sure that you have it on the other side. We're going to get to the other side. I'm absolutely convinced of that. It's a matter of how stronger do we look on the other end.
Well, what a great way to end the panel. And I want to just toss this to Mark to share, but please know how much I appreciate the gifts of insight and time from our esteemed panelists today. And thank you. Thank you very much. So, Mark, would you mind sharing?
Yeah, well, what a great note to end on, as you said, optimism all around, which is just what everybody needs. So thank you very much. Thanks very much to everybody who's joined and for all the questions. Please do note that we've got much more in our series coming up. On July the 2nd, we've got our next panel on the ESG imperative, post-COVID-19 priorities. Then on July the 9th, a special panel with EY involving the view from the C-suite, recent surveys done on geopolitical and economic challenges. And then finally on July the 16th, COVID-19 and the future of global supply chains. So we really hope to welcome you back to those. Just before I go, please let me draw your attention to the evaluation form that will come up shortly on your screen. Any feedback, of course, is always very welcome. And then any other questions, please do get in touch with us if you'd like to engage on these topics with the conference board, with Oxford Analytica. We'll be delighted to do that. So many thanks again, and stay safe, stay well, and goodbye.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.